They said his shadow darkened the valley before sunrise. His armor glimmered like molten bronze beneath the morning haze. The ground trembled when he walked, and his voice rolled across the hills like thunder from another world. For 40 days, his roar echoed through the valley of Elah. Each dawn, each dusk, a challenge that froze the hearts of Israel. His name was Goliath of Gath. He was not merely a warrior. He was the champion, the pride of the Philistine army, a symbol of invincibility. The scriptures describe him as standing 6 cubits and a span, tall, over 9 feet to those who measure in feet and inches. Yet some ancient manuscripts record a smaller figure, around 6 feet and 9 inches. Whichever account you follow, one truth remains. He towered above all others, a living monument of flesh and steel. Upon his head gleamed a bronze helmet. His body was wrapped in scale armor, weighing more than 120 pounds. His legs were guarded by bronze greaves, and a heavy javelin rested between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the iron tip alone weighed 15 pounds. Even his shield was so large, it required a man to carry it before him. The valley fell silent each morning when his steps began to echo across the ridges. The air itself seemed to tighten as he emerged from the Philistine line, his armor flashing against the sunlight. When he spoke, his voice shook the tents of Israel. "Why do you line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me." The words burned with arrogance, yet behind them lay a cruel genius. It was not only a challenge, it was psychological warfare. If Israel sent forth a champion and he lost, their defeat would be total. No army needed, no mercy given. For 40 days, at dawn and at dusk, Goliath came forth, an unbroken rhythm of humiliation. Every shout from his throat deepened the fear of Saul's soldiers until courage became a memory. The men of Israel whispered among themselves, unable to look beyond his height, his armor, his dreadful reputation. Some tried to measure him in cubits, others in steps, but all measured him by fear. They saw an enemy who could not be reached, and a battle already lost before the first sword was drawn. The valley of Elah stretched between the hills, one side trembling with the army of Saul, the other resounding with Philistine laughter. Dust hung thick in the air, settling on armor, on trembling hands, on the faces of those who once believed they were God's chosen warriors. For more than a month, the giant's mockery became the morning alarm of Israel. Every day, he reminded them not just of their weakness, but of their silence. A nation blessed with divine promise had forgotten the sound of faith. Yet even giants cannot see beyond the horizon. Somewhere in the hills of Bethlehem, a shepherd tended his father's sheep. He knew nothing of the challenge that had brought seasoned warriors to their knees. He had never heard the name that made men tremble. But the same God who measured the heavens was preparing him, quietly, patiently, through the solitude of pastures and the roar of lions. The valley waited, breathless, between courage and despair. The Philistine stood beneath the sun, his bronze plates burning like fire, and shouted again into the silence of Israel. No man moved, no sword answered. Hope seemed to wither where fear had taken root. And in that stillness, even the wind carried his taunts like a curse across the fields. But beyond the horizon, unseen by every trembling soldier, footsteps were already on their way, small, unarmored, and fearless. Because sometimes the sound that ends a giant's reign does not come from thunder, but from the whisper of faith approaching from the hills. When David arrived at the camp of Israel, the air was heavy with tension. Warriors whispered, weapons rattled, but hearts were already defeated. He had been sent by his father Jesse from Bethlehem, bearing provisions for his brothers who served in Saul's army. As he walked among the tents, curiosity guided his steps. He heard the rallying cries, saw the formations taking shape, and then a sound that silenced the camp. A roar from across the valley. The same roar that had haunted Israel for 40 days. David turned toward the sound. There, standing between the lines, was the towering figure of Goliath. His armor caught the light like fire. His voice rolled across the plain. "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." The challenge thundered once more. David watched as grown men, warriors seasoned by battle, shrank back into their tents. The young shepherd's eyes narrowed. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The armies of the living God, frozen in fear before one man. His heart burned, not with pride, but with indignation. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The soldiers scoffed. His brothers rebuked him. To them, he was just a boy asking foolish questions. But word of his boldness reached Saul's tent, and the king summoned him. David entered the royal pavilion, still dusty from the journey, his shepherd's staff in hand. Saul looked at him with disbelief. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him," the king said. "You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's faith was not borrowed. It had been forged in solitude. He told Saul of the lion and the bear that had come for his father's sheep, and how he had struck them down with his own hands. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," he said, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." The king hesitated, then finally spoke. "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul offered David his own armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, and the royal sword. David tried them on, but the weight was foreign. The metal clanged against itself as he tried to walk. The garments of kings were not made for shepherds. He removed them and said quietly, "I cannot go with these, for I am not used to them." Then he took his staff in one hand and walked toward the nearby stream. Kneeling beside the water, he searched among the smooth stones and chose 5 small, rounded, unremarkable. He placed them into his shepherd's pouch, each one a silent testimony of trust. To the men who watched him, it looked absurd. A boy walking toward a giant with a stick and a sling. But David wasn't measuring weapons. He was measuring faith. He had learned that God does not save by sword or spear. What mattered was not the size of his hands, but the certainty of his heart. As he stepped into the valley, the sounds of mockery trailed behind him. To the left, the Philistines laughed. To the right, Israel watched in disbelief. But the boy never turned his head. The valley stretched wide before him, silent except for the hum of the wind. The ground was cracked from the sun, the air thick with tension. He felt the pulse of battle beneath his feet, the place where courage was tested and kingdoms were decided. He walked past the boundary where no man had dared to stand for 40 days. With every step, the weight of fear lifted from the earth. Up on the ridge, Goliath stirred. The giant raised his spear and began to descend the slope, his armor clattering like thunder. Behind him, his shield-bearer struggled to keep pace. The contrast was almost absurd. One man encased in bronze, the other clothed in simple wool. But heaven does not measure strength as men do. David tightened his grip on the sling and whispered beneath his breath, not to the enemy, but to the Lord who had never failed him. The armies of Israel held their breath, waiting for the sound of steel. But there would be no clash of swords that day, no echo of metal on metal. The battle that would change history was about to begin with silence, a stone, and faith unshaken. And as the shepherd crossed into the shadow of the giant, even the mountains seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what a single heartbeat of faith would do against the roar of fear. The giant moved first. His laughter split the stillness. When Goliath saw David, he sneered. "Am I a dog," he shouted, "that you come at me with sticks?" Then, lifting his massive spear, he cursed David by his gods. His words were venom, meant to crush the spirit before the body. The shield-bearer before him stepped aside, confident this would be over in moments. But David stood unmoved. The boy's gaze never faltered, his voice calm yet fierce. "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin," he said, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." In that instant, something shifted in the valley. The sound of arrogance gave way to the pulse of destiny. David reached into his pouch and felt the smoothness of stone against his fingertips, cold, familiar, perfect. The sling was already in motion before Goliath could raise his weapon. One fluid motion, one breath, one release. The stone cut through the air with a hiss too swift for the human eye. Then came the dull, final sound of impact, the echo of heaven meeting defiance. The rock sank deep into the giant's forehead, and the great warrior staggered. For the first time in his life, Goliath lost balance. His knees buckled. His weapon slipped from his grasp. The earth shook beneath his fall. A storm of dust rose, and when it cleared, the champion of Gath lay face down in the dirt he had mocked. No sword in David's hand, no armor to his name, only faith and a stone guided by the unseen hand of God. The Philistines stood frozen. Their laughter died. On the opposite ridge, Israel's disbelief turned to awe. The boy ran forward, his steps light as the wind. He reached the fallen warrior, drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath, and ended the battle with one swift stroke. He lifted the severed head high, a grim but certain sign that God had delivered victory not through strength, but through trust. Across the field, the Philistine army broke. The same voices that had mocked Israel now screamed in terror, fleeing toward the gates of Ekron. Israel rose with a shout that rolled like thunder through the valley. Men who moments before had cowered, now charged with renewed fire. They pursued their enemies down the slopes, across the plain, and through the broken gates. The valley that had been ruled by fear now rang with the sound of triumph. Dust swirled where once armor had glimmered, and the echo of the giant's fall became a song of deliverance. When the shouting finally faded, David stood alone beside the body of his fallen foe. The valley was quiet again, but not the same. The silence no longer belonged to fear. It was the hush that follows a miracle. The boy looked down at the lifeless giant, then up toward the heavens. The promise had been kept. The battle is the Lord's. He took the giant's head and carried it to Jerusalem, placing the weapons of Goliath in his own tent as a testimony. The shepherd had entered the field unknown and unarmed. He left it as the deliverer of a nation. Yet in his heart he knew this was not the end. For every giant that falls, another shadow rises in the distance. And though the dust of Gath still clung to his sandals, the true war, the one that would test not his sling, but his soul, was only beginning. The valley of Elah grew silent once more, but silence never lasts long in the stories of men. Goliath's fall sent ripples far beyond Israel's borders. In Philistia, the name David was whispered with hatred. The death of their champion was not an end. It was a wound that demanded vengeance. Among those who had once walked beside Goliath were others of great stature, warriors of the same lineage from the city of Gath. Some called them his brothers, others his kin. Sons of the ancient giants who had haunted the land since the days of Moses. Their hearts burned with fury, and their weapons gleamed with purpose. Years passed. David, once a shepherd, became a king. His hands, that once held a sling, now carried a scepter. Yet the land still trembled under the echo of old enemies. The Philistines, relentless as the tide, returned again and again. And each time they came, there was another giant among them, each one a shadow of the fallen champion. Their names would soon be written in the chronicles of Israel: Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Lami, and the unnamed warrior with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. They rose one after another, determined to reclaim what Goliath had lost. It was during one of these renewed wars that David, older now, took the field again. The sword still felt familiar in his grip, though the strength of his youth had begun to fade. The roar of battle called to him, and he answered as he always had, with courage. But even kings have limits. As the fighting raged, his steps grew heavy. The once smooth rhythm of his strike slowed. His vision blurred beneath the heat of the day, and in the chaos, a figure approached, a giant, his bronze spear shimmering in the sunlight. It was Ishbi-Benob, a descendant of the same race as Goliath, carrying a weapon that weighed 300 shekels of bronze. His eyes burned with vengeance. The giant saw the king falter and moved in for the kill. David's breath came hard. His sword dipped under the weight of exhaustion. For a fleeting moment, the man who had once felled the champion of Gath now stood on the edge of defeat. But God does not abandon those who walk in his purpose. From the ranks behind came a warrior named Abishai, son of Zeruiah, David's loyal friend and the brother of Joab. Seeing the danger, Abishai rushed forward without hesitation. His blade flashed in the sunlight, striking the giant down before he could lift his weapon again. The ground shook as Ishbi-Benob fell, another descendant of the giant silenced by the hand of God. When the dust settled, David's men surrounded him. Their faces bore both relief and fear. They had seen their king falter for the first time. They swore an oath before God and before David that day, "You shall not go out with us to battle any more, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." It was not cowardice, it was reverence. They knew David's life was the light of the nation, the symbol of God's covenant with his people. His safety was now a matter of faith as much as strategy. From that day, David's mighty men rose to take his place in the front lines. They had learned from him what courage looked like, what trust in the Lord truly meant. Each battle against the Philistines became not just a fight for territory, but a testimony of inheritance, faith passed from a shepherd to his soldiers. And though the giants returned, none of them ever triumphed. The wars of the giants were more than a clash of nations. They were echoes of the ancient struggle that began in Genesis, when the mighty men of old first appeared upon the earth. These towering foes represented not just physical enemies, but the persistent defiance of pride against the will of God. And as each one fell, the message of Goliath's defeat was repeated through time. No matter how high evil stands, it will always fall before the hand of faith. The victories of David's men carved new legends into Israel's memory. The people sang again, their voices carrying across the hills where fear once ruled. The giants were not invincible after all. One by one, their names would fade into dust. But their fall would prepare the way for the rise of a kingdom that would stand not by strength or size, but by the favor of the living God. And though the sword had passed from David's hand, the war was not over, for in the distance another shadow was forming, a new giant waiting for his turn to test the courage of Israel's sons. The battlefield was drenched in the dust of countless wars. Years had passed since the fall of Goliath, and David, now a seasoned king, carried the weight of both victory and years. His hair had begun to gray, yet his heart burned with the same fire that once drove a shepherd boy to face a giant. But even the fiercest flame, when pressed by time, begins to flicker. The Philistines had gathered once again in the lowlands, their banners spread across the horizon. They came not just for conquest, but for vengeance. Among their ranks marched a figure whose very presence seemed to drag the air downward, a descendant of the giant, born of the same blood that had once filled the valley of Elah with terror. His name was Ishbi-Benob, the son of one of the Rephaim. His spear was forged of bronze, weighing 300 shekels, and in his hand he carried a new sword, bright and sharp. He had heard the songs Israel sang about David, and he had sworn to silence them forever. David's army met the Philistines in fierce combat. The king himself, refusing to lead from afar, rode into battle as he always had. His sword flashed under the sun, striking down enemies with precision. But the years had taken their toll. His body, once swift and tireless, now trembled under the strain. Sweat burned his eyes, and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. His men were scattered among the enemy, and in the chaos, David found himself alone. Ishbi-Benob saw him falter, the giant's gaze fixed upon the weary king, like a predator upon wounded prey. With a thunderous cry he advanced. The ground quaked beneath his steps as he lifted his massive spear, its bronze head glinting with deadly intent. For the first time in his life, David felt the true weight of mortality pressing upon him. His grip weakened, his knees bent. The sound of the giant's armor grew louder, closer, each step a heartbeat of doom. But heaven watches over those who walk in its covenant. Out of the chaos came Abishai, son of Zeruiah, commander, brother of Joab, and one of the most loyal warriors in all Israel. He saw the danger and moved without hesitation, his eyes locked on the giant towering over his king. Abishai's sword flashed, slicing through the dust-filled air. With the force of divine timing, he struck Ishbi-Benob before the giant could drive his spear home. The blow landed true. The Philistine stumbled. The bronze weapon fell from his grasp, and a cry of rage broke from his throat as Abishai's blade found its mark again. The giant collapsed with a roar that echoed through the valley. When the dust settled, David stood still, his chest heaving. Abishai approached, gripping his sword, eyes still fixed on the fallen enemy. Around them, the soldiers of Israel gathered, shaken by what they had witnessed. Their king, God's chosen, had nearly fallen. In that moment they swore an oath. "You must not go out with us to battle again, lest you extinguish the lamp of Israel." Their words carried both love and fear. They knew that David's life was more than a man's. It was the light of a nation, the proof of God's favor over his people. David listened in silence. He was not proud nor ashamed, only grateful. He looked at Abishai, this man who had stood in the gap when strength failed him. He saw not just loyalty, but providence. For even the greatest heroes, even kings anointed by God, are not spared the moments when they must be saved. And in that truth lies the humility that preserves every leader called by heaven. Abishai would go on to become one of David's mightiest warriors, a man of fierce courage and unwavering devotion. He had once walked with David into Saul's camp to seize the king's spear, and now he had saved his life on the field of battle. His blade had preserved not just a man, but the light of Israel. Yet even as the people celebrated this victory, the king felt the weight of something deeper. His days of leading charges were over. His calling had shifted from warrior to guardian of faith, from the sling to the psalm. The death of Ishbi-Benob was more than another triumph. It was a divine reminder that no one, not even David, stood victorious alone. The same God who guided a stone against Goliath now sent a friend to strike down the next giant. Every victory, every rescue, every breath, it all belonged to the Lord. And though Ishbi-Benob had fallen, the earth did not rest. Beyond the hills of Judah, another of Gath's sons lifted his weapon, vowing that the bloodline of giants would not end with him. The sun rose over the battlefield like a burning coin, glinting off the blades of countless soldiers. The echoes of Ishbi-Benob's fall had barely faded, yet the Philistines returned with renewed fury. Their pride demanded vengeance. Their faith rested not in gods, but in giants. Among them stood another warrior of monstrous size, known as Saph, or Saphat as some called him, the next in the long shadow cast by Goliath of Gath. Saph was not just a fighter, he was a symbol. His lineage traced back to the Rephaim, the ancient giants who had survived in the strongholds of the Philistines after Israel conquered the land. His armor bore the scars of past wars, and his voice carried the same arrogance that once thundered from the mouth of Goliath. When he stepped forward, entire regiments shifted behind him, emboldened by his sheer presence. His spear shimmered like polished brass in the morning sun, and his roar carried over the valley like the echo of an ancient curse. But this battle was no longer David's to fight. The king had kept his vow. He would not risk extinguishing the lamp of Israel. Instead, he watched from a distance as Sibbecai the Hushathite, one of his elite warriors, prepared to face the towering Philistine. Sibbecai was not a man of many words, but of quiet conviction. He had learned from David what it meant to trust God above all else. The same courage that once drove a shepherd to face a giant now lived within this soldier's heart. The armies stood still as Saph advanced, his heavy footsteps sinking into the soil. He laughed when he saw his opponent, a man of average height, armed with nothing that could compare to his own massive spear. To the eyes of men, it was a hopeless contest. But God had a way of repeating his lessons through new generations. What faith had once done in David, it would now do again through the hands of those who followed his example. The clash came swift and fierce. Saph swung his weapon with enough force to shatter shields, each strike echoing like thunder across the field. Yet Sibbecai moved with agility and precision. He had not come to match the giant's strength, he had come to outlast it. Step by step he circled, waiting for the moment when arrogance would open a weakness. And when it came, his blade struck true. The air filled with the sound of steel meeting flesh, followed by the giant's final cry as he fell to the ground with a crash that sent dust billowing skyward. A hush fell over the valley. For the second time since Goliath's death, a son of the giants had been slain, not by a king, but by one who carried the king's faith. Israel's soldiers erupted in triumph. The memory of their first victory returned to them, like fire rekindled in dry wood. Their courage rose not from numbers or weapons, but from the knowledge that God's favor had not departed. David watched from afar, his heart both proud and humbled. The same God who had strengthened his arm in youth was now raising others to continue the fight. The shepherd's faith had multiplied. It now lived in the hearts of warriors like Sibbecai, in men who no longer waited for their king to act, but believed that the Lord could use them as he once used David. It was a passing of the torch, a sacred inheritance not of blood, but of belief. Saph's fall carried more meaning than another victory in war. It marked a transition, the moment when Israel's destiny was no longer tied to one man's courage, but to a nation learning to live by faith. The giants of Gath had thought their strength eternal, but each death reminded them that divine purpose does not fade with age. It only changes form. The God who once guided a sling now guided swords, raising new leaders to defend his people. That day, the Philistines retreated once more, their armies broken and their idols silent. Israel's camp echoed with the songs of deliverance, as warriors lifted their hands in gratitude. The same refrain that once belonged to David now belonged to all of them. The battle is the Lord's. David turned away from the field, the wind carrying the scent of victory and the faint ringing of steel. His heart knew this was no coincidence. Each triumph was a living reminder that when one generation's strength fades, another rises to take its place. God never leaves his people without a champion. He only changes the hands that hold the weapon. And while the songs of victory filled the air, word began to spread across Philistia. Another descendant of the giant had stepped forward, bearing a weapon thicker than a weaver's beam and a name that would soon be known across the land: Lami, brother of Goliath. Word of Saph's death traveled swiftly across Philistia, like smoke carried by a bitter wind. Among those who heard it was another of the ancient warriors from Gath, Lami, brother of Goliath. His name was spoken with reverence among the Philistines, for his bloodline was their last great hope to restore honor to the fallen house of giants. Lami's spear, said to be as thick as a weaver's beam, glinted beneath the sun, as if forged from the same curse that had shaped his brother's weapon. In his heart burned not only vengeance, but the pride of a race that refused to be forgotten. The battle came again, this time at Gob, a place already heavy with history and blood. The Philistines advanced with renewed strength, their faith not in their gods, but in the legacy of their fallen champion. Lami led the charge, towering above his men, his shadow stretching long across the plain. The sight of him revived memories Israel had hoped never to see again, the figure of a man too large to defeat, armed with weapons too heavy to lift. Many of the soldiers still remembered the stories told by their fathers, stories of the valley where Goliath fell. Now, standing before his brother, they felt the echo of that same fear, but the days of trembling had passed. Israel no longer looked to one man for courage. The spirit of David lived among them, and it stirred in the hearts of his mighty men. From their ranks stepped Elhanan son of Jair, a warrior from Bethlehem, the same city that once sent a shepherd into battle with a sling. Elhanan's resolve was steady, his eyes fixed on the giant ahead. Though the enemy towered above him, he saw not the size of his foe, but the certainty of God's promise. The two approached one another on the field as the armies held their breath. Lami's laughter was low and cruel. He raised his spear with ease, its weight immense, its point gleaming like fire. The ground seemed to shudder as he took his first steps toward the lone Israelite. But Elhanan did not waver. He waited, silent, as if listening for something beyond the noise of war. And when the giant lifted his weapon to strike, Elhanan moved, swift as wind through the barley fields of Bethlehem. His blade flashed, meeting the open space between armor and flesh. The blow landed clean and final. Lami's roar broke across the valley and then was gone. The brother of Goliath, the last great pride of Gath, fell to the earth that had already claimed his kin. For generations, confusion would linger over the record of this battle. In one ancient scroll, the chronicler wrote that Elhanan had slain Goliath the Gittite, but in the later writings, the truth was clarified. It was Lami, the brother of Goliath, who had fallen by his hand. The small variation of a single word, the brother of, would shape centuries of debate. Yet the deeper truth was unshaken. The victory belonged not to men, but to the God who directed their steps. Whether written by the historian or spoken by the soldier, the story ended the same way. A giant fell, and faith prevailed. Israel's camp erupted in celebration. The men lifted Elhanan upon their shoulders, chanting his name with gratitude and awe. But Elhanan himself said little. He knew he had not fought alone. Just as David had once declared, "The battle is the Lord's." Elhanan understood that the same divine hand which guided a stone from a sling had guided his sword that day. News of Lami's death broke the spirit of many Philistine warriors. The house of Gath, once a symbol of terror, now stood emptied of its heroes. The songs they had sung of invincible strength turned to whispers of defeat. Israel had not only conquered the giants of their land, but the memory of fear that came with them. David received the report in Jerusalem. He bowed his head in reverent silence. The God who had once lifted his hand in youth was now lifting others. He no longer needed to swing the sword or lead the charge. His greatest victories were now being won through the faith of those he had inspired. The torch had been passed fully. The light of courage, once a single flame, had become a wildfire across Israel. Yet the chronicles of war were not complete. Even as Israel rejoiced, word reached David's court of another enemy rising in Gath, a man whose strength defied nature itself, a figure marked by deformity so strange that it turned fear into legend. For among the remnants of the giants there still lived one whose hands bore 6 fingers each, whose feet carried 6 toes, and whose heart carried the pride of every fallen brother before him. Another war rose on the horizon, like thunder returning to familiar hills. The Philistines, unwilling to accept the ruin of their champions, gathered once more at Gath, the city that had given birth to giants. Yet this time their leader was no ordinary warrior. He was a man of monstrous form, a creature whose very body seemed to mock the image of man. He bore 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in all. To the ancient mind, such deformity was both a mark of fear and a sign of unnatural strength. To Israel, he was the last echo of a bloodline cursed by pride. The chronicles tell us that this giant, though unnamed, was a man of great stature. His presence alone commanded silence. When he stepped forward to challenge the armies of Israel, the Philistines shouted with renewed arrogance. Their enemies might have slain Goliath, Saph, Ishbi-Benob, and Lami, but this, they believed, was something greater, something different. They saw in him the final hope of a dying legacy, the last attempt of fallen strength to rise again. But Israel was no longer the trembling army that had once cowered before a single man. They had faced their fears, buried their giants, and learned that victory did not depend on size, but on faith. Among their ranks stood Jonathan, son of Shimea, David's brother, a man who had watched his siblings' courage change the course of their nation. The same blood of Bethlehem flowed through his veins. The same trust in the living God burned in his heart. When the 6-fingered man came forth, Jonathan stepped forward to meet him. The field was still. The air carried a heavy stillness as the 2 men approached each other. The giant's armor creaked under his massive frame, and his shadow swallowed the light. His laughter rolled across the plain, deep and cruel, as he mocked Israel once again. "Where is your king?" he roared. "Where is the boy with the sling?" His words fell like stones, but Jonathan did not answer. He had no need for taunts. He had already seen what faith could do when the odds were impossible. The battle was short but fierce. The giant struck first, his enormous weapon tearing through the air. Each blow fell like the crash of thunder, forcing Jonathan backward. Dust rose around them, shrouding the clash in a choking haze. Yet Jonathan's resolve never faltered. He remembered the lessons his brother had taught him. that no enemy was greater than the God who stood behind him. With a sudden cry, he surged forward, sidestepping the swing of the giant's weapon and striking deep with his own blade. The steel found its mark beneath the armor, and the six-fingered man staggered. Another strike, swift and final, brought the colossus crashing to the ground. Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to stop. The Philistine army, once so confident in their monstrous leader, stood frozen as the giant's body lay still. The dust settled upon the field of Gath, covering the last of a cursed lineage. There, the final remnant of the giants fell, not by a king, not by a hero of legend, but by a man of quiet faith. When the men of Israel lifted their eyes, they saw what God had done once again. Every descendant of the ancient giants, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the sons of Gath, had been defeated, not through numbers, but through righteousness. One by one, the symbols of fear had been erased from the land. The promise spoken in the valley of Elah had reached its fulfillment. The battle is the Lord's. In the camp that evening, the soldiers gathered around Jonathan. They sang not only of his victory, but of the God who had delivered it. Their voices rose into the night sky, carrying the same faith that had begun with David. No one spoke of fear anymore. The giants were gone, their weapons broken, their names turned to dust. What remained was the enduring truth that courage born of faith outlives any enemy born of flesh. Far away, in the quiet of his chambers, David received the news. He bowed his head and wept, not from sorrow but from awe. The God who had guided his sling in the days of youth had guided Jonathan's sword now. A generation had risen who no longer needed to borrow faith. They had found their own. The torch had passed completely, and Israel's courage no longer depended on one man's strength, but on a nation's belief. The land that had once trembled beneath the feet of giants now rested in peace. The echo of their fall faded into the valleys, and the people of God stood victorious, not because they were mighty, but because they were faithful. Yet though the giants of flesh were gone, a deeper question lingered in the hearts of many. Where had such beings come from, and what ancient darkness had first given them form? Long before Goliath's shadow fell across the valley of Elah, Scripture spoke of other giants, figures from a time so ancient that their memory feels like myth. Yet the Bible records them not as fantasy, but as history shrouded in mystery. The fall of Goliath and his kin was not just the end of a lineage. It was the final echo of a question that had haunted humanity since the days before the flood. Who were the giants of old? The book of Genesis opens the first door into this mystery. It tells of an age when men began to multiply upon the earth and daughters were born to them. The text declares, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives whomever they chose." Then it adds a chilling line. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. These words have stirred debate for thousands of years. Who were these sons of God? Were they angels who crossed forbidden boundaries, mighty rulers abusing their power, or the descendants of Seth, the godly line corrupted by the daughters of Cain? Ancient Jewish and early Christian tradition leaned toward the supernatural view that these sons of God were indeed fallen angels who abandoned their heavenly domain and took human wives, producing offspring of unnatural strength and stature. These offspring were called Nephilim, meaning the fallen ones. According to this view, their birth corrupted the human race, spreading violence and arrogance until God judged the world with the great flood. The Apostle Jude seems to echo this idea when he writes of the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own habitation. These he has kept in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. Yet others argue that the passage refers not to angels, but to men, specifically the powerful rulers of that ancient age who took wives by force, creating dynasties of cruelty and violence. They interpret sons of God as earthly kings or warriors, men who set themselves up as divine. Still others believe the phrase points to the mingling of two bloodlines, the righteous descendants of Seth intermarrying with the corrupt line of Cain, which led to moral decline and spiritual compromise. Each interpretation carries its own reasoning. and each reflects humanity's attempt to understand a world once filled with darkness beyond imagination. Regardless of which view one holds, the consequence was the same. The earth became filled with wickedness. Every thought and intention of man's heart was evil continually. God looked upon his creation and was grieved. Yet even then mercy prevailed. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. In Noah and his family, the line of faith survived, while the corrupted world perished beneath the floodwaters. Many believe that with the flood, the Nephilim perished as well. Yet Scripture adds an unsettling phrase, "and also afterward." That small addition, "and also afterward," suggests that giant-like beings reappeared after the flood. The Book of Numbers records Israel's spies trembling before the inhabitants of Canaan. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. These were the Anakim, a race of towering warriors who occupied the hill country. Moses described them as descendants of the Rephaim, an older group of giants that once inhabited the land. The last of these Rephaim was Og, king of Bashan, whose bed of iron measured over 13 feet long. In time, the Anakim were driven out by the armies of Israel and scattered into the Philistine cities, among them Gath. It was here, generations later, that their bloodline resurfaced in the form of Goliath and his brothers. Whether the giants of Gath were direct descendants of the pre-flood Nephilim, or simply remnants of the Rephaim, their existence connected the ancient past to David's present. They stood as living reminders that evil, though defeated, often returns in new forms. Some scholars suggest that these later giants were not supernatural at all, but the result of human genetic traits, perhaps rare conditions such as gigantism or acromegaly, passed down through generations. Yet Scripture's emphasis is not on biology but on theology. The giants symbolize rebellion against God, human pride magnified to monstrous proportions. Their defeat, from Og of Bashan to Goliath of Gath, marks the triumph of faith over arrogance, of divine order over chaos. The thread that runs through all these accounts is unmistakable. Humanity's struggle has never been merely against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces that seek to corrupt what God has made good. Whether the Nephilim were fallen angels' offspring, tyrant kings, or symbolic figures, the lesson remains eternal. When mankind forgets the boundaries of heaven, destruction follows. In David's time, the giants of the earth still walked the battlefield. But their fall was more than a military victory. It was a restoration of divine balance. Every stone hurled, every sword raised in faith was a declaration that God reigns, and that no power born of rebellion can endure before his will. And though the giants of flesh and blood were gone, the legacy of their defiance lived on, in the pride of kingdoms, the rise of empires, and the quiet wars waged in every human heart where faith must still slay its giants. The echoes of the fallen giants had long faded from the valleys of Israel, but their memory lingered in the hearts of men. Generations had passed since a shepherd stood before Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone, yet the lesson of that day continued to shape a nation. What began as a single act of faith had become a legacy that outlived every sword and every warrior. It was not the power of a weapon that changed Israel's destiny, but the conviction that the battle belonged to the Lord. David's victory over Goliath marked more than a triumph of courage. It redefined the meaning of strength itself. He proved that faith could accomplish what armies could not, that obedience could do what experience could never guarantee. The sling became a symbol of holy defiance, a simple object turned sacred by the hand that trusted it. Long after David's hand grew old and his weapon was set aside, that same faith continued to echo through the lives of those who followed him. The battles of his mighty men, the fall of Saph, Lami, Ishbi-Benob, and the six-fingered man, all were testaments that faith, once kindled, could ignite others into action. Israel's story did not end with the death of giants. It continued in the rise of new generations who learned that victory is not measured by the size of one's enemy, but by the depth of one's trust. The shepherd who became a king left behind more than songs and psalms. He left behind a blueprint for every believer who would face impossible odds. "The Lord does not save by sword or spear," David had said, and time proved him right. The same God who guided the stone that day still guided his people through every war, every trial, every shadow that sought to rise against them. Even centuries later, prophets and poets remembered the sling. They spoke of it not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of deliverance. In the face of empires and idols, of pride and rebellion, the story of David reminded Israel that their true strength was never in numbers, chariots, or walls. It was in covenant. When faith led, victory followed. When faith faltered, even kings fell. This rhythm of dependence and deliverance would define the history of God's people for generations to come. But the legacy of that sling stretches even further. In it lies the pattern of divine redemption, the way God chooses the small to shame the mighty, the humble to overcome the proud. The shepherd of Bethlehem foreshadowed another who would rise from the same hills centuries later, one who would not merely slay giants of flesh, but conquer sin and death itself. The lineage of faith that began with David found its fulfillment in Christ, the Son of David, whose victory was not won with stone or steel, but with sacrifice. Just as the shepherd faced the champion of Gath alone, so the Savior faced the darkness of the world alone, and won. Every believer who hears the story of David and Goliath stands in the same valley. The names of our giants may differ, fear, doubt, temptation, injustice, but their challenge is the same, to defy the living God and to make his people tremble. And just as before, the answer is unchanged. We do not fight alone. We do not win by power or by strategy, but by faith that endures when every voice of reason says it cannot. The sling and the stone still speak. They whisper of courage born not from confidence, but from conviction. In that sense, Goliath's defeat was not merely an event of the past. It is a mirror for every soul who stands before something larger than themselves. The same hand that steadied David's aim steadies ours when faith takes its stand against fear. And just as the shepherd lifted his eyes to the heavens before releasing the stone, so must we look upward before we act, trusting that the battle's outcome is written long before the first step is taken. When the sun finally set over David's life, he looked upon a kingdom at peace. The giants were gone. The valleys that once echoed with curses now carried songs of praise. Yet the true victory was not measured in land or conquest, but in hearts transformed by trust. The shepherd's courage had become a nation's inheritance, a legacy carved not in stone, but in faith. And so the story ends where it began, in a valley, with faith facing fear. Only this time the outcome is already known. For every giant that rises, every shadow that looms, the answer remains the same. The battle is the Lord's. David's sling rests silent now, but its message still speaks. It reminds us that God's power is not found in the mighty, but in the willing. Not in those who stand tallest, but in those who kneel deepest. Faith, not force, wins the war. For when faith takes its stand, every giant, no matter how ancient, how powerful, or how proud, must fall before the living God.